Thanks, Anthony. Let's now have a look at miracles generically. First, through the eyes of a philosopher. Everybody should study a bit of philosophy. The philosophical debate about miracles is, well, it's reached a bit of a grumpy stalemate between the atheists, those who don't believe in God, and the theists, those that do. And both sides recognise that what you think about the rationality or otherwise of miracles really boils down to the kind of universe that you think you're living in. So, if I'm an atheist, I believe in a closed universe. I believe that the laws of nature define the limits of what is possible in the universe. There's no lawgiver or God behind those laws. So, in principle, miracles are just irrational. They are nonsense. And no amount of evidence will convince me otherwise that a miracle has actually happened. But if I'm a theist, well, then I believe in an open universe. I believe that the laws of nature do not define the limits of what is possible, and the laws themselves point to a lawgiver or God behind the laws. And since there is a lawgiver who can act beyond the natural laws, then it's rational to believe in the possibility of miracles. And I'm free to, and in fact it's rational to believe that miracles have occurred if there is good evidence that suggests it. So, there's the dilemma. You can't actually solve this unless you first decide whether there is a God or whether there isn't. And interestingly, plenty of biblical scholars are atheists. They hold that first view. They don't believe in God, and therefore they don't believe in miracles. And perhaps you find that surprising that people who study the Bible don't actually believe in God. Well, having been brought up in England, I don't find anything surprising about that. I refer you to an episode of the sitcom Yes, Prime Minister, when Jim Hacker, the Prime Minister, asks incredulously, "You mean there are people in the church who don't believe in God?" And Sir Humphrey replies, "Oh yes, in fact, most of the bishops." Well, like every comic exaggeration, it has an element of truth. So how do such people interpret John 6, the feeding of the 5,000? Well, one way is to say that, well, it's just all made up. It's total fiction, a fraud, invented by Christians to make Jesus look good. Another strategy is to say that the stories are myths. Now, this doesn't mean they're made up, it means they are parables to illustrate spiritual truths. So the argument goes like this. Of course, Jesus didn't really make lots of bread from just a few loaves. We're never meant to believe that literally. It's a parable to show that Jesus can spiritually nourish us if we listen to his teaching. It's just a myth. And the third way that story can be interpreted is that it has a natural explanation. So, for instance, 19th century German theologian, they're always German, Heinrich Poulos, suggested this, that when the boy revealed his packed lunch, well, then everybody else got just a little bit guilty and they brought out their secret packed lunches and everybody had enough to eat. Well, it's sweet, but of course it's nonsense if you believe there is a God who sits behind the laws of nature and acts through them and beyond these laws as he wishes. So, that's the philosophy of miracles. What about the history? Well, here's an interesting fact. Virtually every scholar that specialises in the area of historical Jesus, even the most sceptical, agree that Jesus did things that everybody at the time thought were miracles. And they reach this historical conclusion because the evidence is overwhelming. It ticks two important criteria. It's both early and it's widespread. So the miracles of Jesus appear across all the sources. In fact, historians recognize 8 separate sources in the 60 years after they were performed, and 3 within 20 years. And as far as ancient history goes, then that is as good as it gets by far. So someone like Paula Fredrickson, she's a historian from Boston University and not a Christian. She says this: did Jesus of Nazareth then perform miracles? I do not believe that God occasionally suspends the operation of natural law. What I think Jesus must have done, in other words, must conform to what I think is possible. Which sounds like she's going to say, no, he didn't do the miracles, but this is what she said. So to answer my question, yes, I think that Jesus probably did perform deeds that contemporaries viewed as miracles. Notice she chooses her words very carefully, doesn't she? She's writing as a historian, remember, and under the rules of the game, well, she can't say anything beyond the evidence that she has. She can't say that she actually believes in miracles, because then she'll be straying into another game, onto the philosopher's pitch, if you like. But we are not scholars. We're not restricted by any of these rules. What can we say and what can we believe? Well, if there's enough evidence to convince skeptical scholars that Jesus probably did perform deeds that everybody thought were miracles, then that should be enough for us who believe in an open universe to believe that they actually were miracles. We have exactly the kind of evidence we need. So I believe that Jesus did perform miracles. I believe that Jesus did feed 5,000 plus people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Well, that's the philosophy and the history. What about the theology? What do the signs signal? And the first thing to notice here is that there is a huge ambiguity in John's Gospel about how people respond to Jesus' signs. And you may have noticed this if you've been following the reading plan throughout John's Gospel. When you hear, therefore, that people en masse are believing in Jesus, then you should be a little bit suspicious, because this often is only a half belief, a belief with mixed motives. So, for instance, in chapter 2 of John's Gospel, we read this. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. Sounds good, doesn't it? But then John writes, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony of mankind, for he knew what was in each person. And then immediately in chapter 3, we're introduced to Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus because of the miracles that he's performing, but of course is a long way from the truth. So we should be a bit suspicious when, at the introduction of our story, in verse 2, we read this. So verse 2, chapter 6, a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Now, we shouldn't be too impressed by that just yet. We should be asking the question, they've seen the signs, but do they know what they signal? They love the gifts that Jesus hands out, the healing, but do they know the giver? And our suspicions are confirmed by the time we get to the end of the story, and glance down, if you will, at verse 14 and 15 that we just had read. We see something rather odd, that Jesus then is tried to sort of pushed into becoming king by force. The crowd see this sign as nothing more than a sort of expression of brute power. And so they think, well, let's make him king. to kick out the Romans. They've been occupying our country for nearly 100 years. But Jesus sees their motives and he escapes to a quiet place. And for some, the motives are even worse. So in verse 25, when the same crowd have sort of tracked Jesus down, when they found him on the other side of the day, they asked, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." The crowds, they liked the show. They loved the fill. So they didn't see the miracle as a sign of Jesus' identity and mission. They just want their hunger to be satisfied, their bellies to be filled. And the rest of the chapter, well, it explains what the sign actually means amongst all this ambiguity and mixed motives. The feeding of the 5,000 is about Jesus giving himself as the bread of life. That's what the miracle means. He didn't come as a political king or a conqueror or to feed hungry bellies. Jesus came to give himself as the bread of eternal life. And the clue to that is tucked away in a little editorial statement that John makes almost as an aside in verse 4. And I'm sure that most of you would have missed it. So in verse 4, chapter 6, he says this: "The Jewish Passover festival was near." Seems like an inconsequential time marker, doesn't it? But it's the key that unlocks the whole meaning of this sign. We are meant to be thinking Passover at this point. And that's why we had the Old Testament read to us from Exodus chapter 12. The story of the Passover and the festival that follows. And to understand the speech of Jesus that we will have read to us in a minute, we've got to be thinking this, that the Passover is two festivals in one. If you know this, then you'll understand what Jesus means. We know, I think, that it is a sacrificial lamb festival. So on the first day, the Jews kill a lamb. The blood is sprayed at the base of the temple. They eat the flesh of the lamb. It's a reminder of the salvation of their people centuries ago in Egypt, when God's judgment fell on the Egyptians but passed over the Israelites who had sacrificed the lamb. That's the meaning of this part of the festival, and I suspect that most of us will know that. But less well known to us, known to the Jews, is that it's an 8-day bread festival. The Passover festival is in fact called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. For 8 days following the lamb's sacrifice, they eat this special bread made without yeast, as a reminder that when they fled Egypt, they had to go quickly. They didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise if it had yeast in it. It's a bread festival. And they've got to hold all these things in mind: sacrificial blood, flesh, and bread. So let's now hear Jesus' speech, and then I'll make a few remarks and conclude.